The atmospheric pressure over Manhattan collapsed in a single jagged line of impossible vacuum. It was not a stormfront or a sonic boom, but a localized failure of physics that sounded like a tectonic plate snapping in midair. For 3 seconds the noise silenced the constant hum of the city, erasing the sounds of traffic and sirens, before the shockwave finally caught up to reality and shattered the glass facades of 12 skyscrapers surrounding Columbus Circle. There was no explosion of fire, only the sudden, violent displacement of air caused by an object moving faster than the laws of this universe allowed. The rift did not close. It hung in the sky like a scar, bleeding a dark purple-black energy that tasted like ozone and terrified instinct. Above the chaotic screaming of the crowd and the shriek of twisting metal, a singular structure began to groan under a stress it was never designed to endure. Vought Tower, the symbol of corporate godhood and manufactured security, had been struck. It was not a bomb. The sensors on the 82nd floor registered no thermal spike and no chemical residue. They registered only kinetic force applied with surgical precision. A diagonal cleavage line appeared on the tower's eastern face, severing the reinforced steel beams and blast-proof glass, as if they were wet paper. The top 20 stories of the building shifted, sliding 4 feet to the left with a grinding screech that vibrated in the teeth of every observer within 5 miles. Dust billowed out from the wound in the architecture, but the collapse halted there. The massive structure held in place by the remaining friction of the cut itself. From the jagged lip of the destroyed executive landing pad, a figure fell. It did not fly. It did not hover with the anti-gravity arrogance of the Homelander, or glide with the aerodynamic grace of Queen Maeve. It plummeted like a stone, heavy and unconcerned with aerodynamics. The figure impacted the asphalt of the intersection below, with enough force to crater the street and flip a transport truck onto its side. The dust cloud from the impact was thick, suffocating, and charged with a static electricity that made hair stand on end. Civilians who had been filming the destruction of the tower dropped their phones, overcome by a sudden, primal wave of nausea. This was not the celebrity awe they felt for the Seven. This was the biological response to an apex predator entering a closed ecosystem. In the center of the crater, amidst the ruined pavement and the hissing steam of broken subterranean pipes, Roronoa Zoro stood up. He did not look at the devastated skyline or the panic he had caused. He looked at the 3 swords at his hip, checking their alignment with a casual, practiced irritation. He was bleeding. A fresh cut across his chest steamed in the cool New York air, the blood darker and denser than human blood should be. He gripped the hilt of Enma, the blade vibrating with a hunger that made the nearby streetlights flicker and burst. Zoro exhaled, a visible plume of breath that seemed to carry the weight of a storm. He believed he was still in the new world. He assumed the towering glass canyons were some trick of a devil fruit user, or a hidden level of Egghead Island he had wandered into by mistake. He did not know he had just severed the headquarters of that planet's most powerful corporation. He did not know that satellite imaging had already flagged him as a super-terrorist level threat. All he knew was that the air here smelled like oil and deceit, and the geometry of the streets made no sense. He took a step forward, and the killing intent radiating from his body was so potent that a Vought security team approaching with rifles lowered their weapons, their knees buckling under the sheer metaphysical weight of a spirit that had conquered death. The timeline had not just branched, it had been cut open. The dust settling over Columbus Circle was not merely particulate matter, but a suspension of pulverized concrete, atomized glass, and the frantic pheromonal stench of collective human terror. In the center of the crater, Roronoa Zoro sheathed Wado Ichimonji with a sharp, distinct click that cut through the cacophony of sirens wailing from every avenue. To him, the noise was annoying, a discordant screeching that lacked the rhythmic crashing of ocean waves or the honest roar of a beast. He adjusted the green haramaki around his waist, his hand lingering near his swords as he scanned the perimeter. The towering steel canyons of New York blocked the horizon, disorienting his internal compass, which was already famously unreliable. He needed a landmark, a scent of salt water, or the loud, rubbery voice of his captain. But instead, he was surrounded by flashing red and blue lights, and men in black tactical gear shouting orders in a dialect of English that felt rushed and clipped. The Vought Tactical Response Team, Vought Security Services Unit Alpha, had arrived within 4 minutes of the tower's partial collapse. These were not police officers. They were private military contractors conditioned to clean up the messes left by gods. The team leader, Commander Higgins, stared through the thermal optic of his rifle, his heart rate monitor spiking on the HUD inside his helmet. The figure in the pit did not make sense. Thermal imaging showed a body temperature slightly higher than average, but the density readings were impossible. The subject's muscle mass appeared compacted, woven with a density that rivaled industrial polymers. Yet he moved with the fluid slackness of a bored athlete. Higgins had seen Supes up close. He knew the arrogance of Homelander and the twitchy energy of A-Train. This was different. The green-haired man looked tired, confused, and utterly unimpressed by the 12 laser sights currently dancing on his chest. Zoro scratched the back of his neck, his single eye narrowing as he looked up at the circle of armed men. He assumed they were Marines. The uniforms were different, darker, and more militaristic than the white and blue of the world government, but the intent was the same. They held their weapons with the rigid anxiety of men who knew they were outmatched but were forbidden to retreat. Zoro cleared his throat, the sound deep and resonant, causing several of the soldiers to flinch. He asked where the ship was. He asked where the ocean was. He did not shout. He simply projected his voice with the assumption that he would be obeyed. When no answer came, only the tightening of fingers on triggers, Zoro sighed. He took one step up the slope of the crater. The engagement began not with a command but with a reflex. A rookie officer on the southern perimeter, overwhelmed by the oppressive aura of dread leaking from the swordsman, fired his rifle. The 5.56 mm round traveled at supersonic speed towards Zoro's left shoulder. In the Vought universe, physics dictates that a bullet strikes flesh, transfers kinetic energy, and destroys tissue unless that tissue is reinforced by compound 5. Zoro did not dodge. He did not block. He simply existed in the path of the bullet. The projectile impacted his skin and flattened, falling to the asphalt like a discarded coin. There was no blood. There was no bruise. There was only the dull thud of lead hitting something harder than itself. The silence that followed lasted less than a second before the entire perimeter opened fire. Hundreds of rounds converged on the center of the crater. The air filled with the deafening roar of automatic fire, creating a kill box of crisscrossing trajectories designed to liquefy a biological target. Dust and debris kicked up in violent plumes, obscuring the swordsman completely. Commander Higgins held the fire order for 10 continuous seconds, burning through magazines before signaling a ceasefire. The smoke drifted lazily in the wind tunnel created by the avenues. The soldiers waited, expecting to see a ruin of gore, or perhaps a soup, regenerating from the trauma. Instead, as the grey cloud dissipated, they saw a blue glow. Zoro had drawn one sword, not fully, but enough to create a barrier of parrying force. He stood in the same spot, looking annoyed. The bullets lay in a pile around his boots, not deflected, but stopped dead, their momentum killed by an invisible pressure. This was not the invulnerability of the Homelander, who ignored physics. This was the armament Haki, an imposition of will that overwrote the material properties of the incoming fire. To the Vought analysts, watching the live feed in the Situation Room 80 blocks away, it looked like a glitch in reality. No Supe had a force field that tight to the skin. No Super blocked bullets by seemingly intimidating the kinetic energy into submission. Zoro looked at the men, his patience evaporating. He disliked bullying the weak, and these men were fragile. Their spirits were thin, driven by paycheck and fear rather than conviction. He sheathed the blade fully and vanished. It was not teleportation. It was pure explosive speed, the burst of movement known as Saru to the Marines of his world. But here, without the dampening effect of the Grand Line's dense atmosphere, it created a sonic boom that shattered the windows of the surrounding storefronts. Zoro reappeared behind the southern line of soldiers. He did not draw his sword. He used the back of his hand, a single sweeping strike that caught 3 men in the chest. They did not die, but the impact lifted them off their feet and threw them 40 yards down the street, crumpling the front of a parked taxi. The rest of the squad spun around, panic taking over their tactical training. But the swordsman was already walking away, heading north, simply because the wind felt slightly fresher in that direction. High above, in the crippled Vought Tower, the mood was apoplectic. The conference room on the 99th floor was tilted at a 3-degree angle due to the structural damage, forcing the executives to brace themselves against the mahogany table. Homelander stood by the shattered window, the wind whipping his cape. His eyes were glowing with a low-level simmer of heat vision, a physical manifestation of his fragile ego fracturing. He had felt the impact. He had felt the tower move. For the first time in his life, something had struck his sanctuary, and he hadn't seen it coming. He turned to Ashley Barrett, was frantically pulling hair out of her scalp while screaming into 2 phones simultaneously. The narrative was slipping. Vought International relied on the myth of control. Attacks happened, but they were stopped by the 7. Catastrophes occurred, but they were managed by the 7. This was different. A man with swords had just cut the corporate headquarters and was now walking through Midtown Manhattan, treating their private army like mosquitoes. Homelander demanded to know who the villain was. He wanted a name. He wanted a supervillain origin story he could mock on talk shows before lasering the bastard in half. But the analytics team had nothing. No match in the database. No Red River orphanage records. No recognizable Compound Vi signature in the thermal scan. Just a man. A man with 3 swords and a heart rate that beat like a slow war drum. Stan Edgar, appearing via secure video link, remained the only calm presence in the room. He instructed them to contain the situation before it became a federal issue. He explicitly forbade Homelander from engaging immediately. Edgar was a man of calculation. He recognized an unknown variable. If Homelander went down there and failed to kill this stranger instantly, the illusion of the 7's omnipotence would shatter. They needed a test subject. They needed to throw bodies at the problem to measure its limits. Edgar authorized the deployment of Black Noir and a secondary containment team of B-list heroes who were expendable, hungry for fame, and powerful enough to force the stranger to reveal his hand. Meanwhile, in a dingy basement apartment in Flatiron, the boys were watching the news feed. Billy Butcher sat in the dark, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in his eyes. He leaned forward, studying the shaky footage filmed by a civilian phone. It showed the moment Zoro had backhanded the security team. Butcher rewound the clip, playing it frame by frame. He saw the blur. He saw the lack of effort. He saw the swords. Frenchie was pacing behind him, muttering about particle physics and energy displacement, trying to make sense of the tower's clean cut. Huey Campbell was hyperventilating, asking if this was a new member of the Seven or a weapon from Russia. Butcher lit a cigarette, the smoke curling up toward the peeling ceiling paint. He noted that the stranger didn't fly. He didn't shoot lasers. He carried weapons, which meant he relied on skill, not just biology. But what interested Butcher most was the look in the stranger's eye, or the pixels that represented it. It was the look of a man who answered to no one. It was the look of a wild dog that had walked into a kennel of poodles. Butcher grinned, a predatory expression that promised violence. He told the team to gear up. They weren't going to fight the swordsman. They were going to follow him. If Vought was bleeding, Butcher wanted to be there to twist the knife, and this green-haired lunatic might just be the biggest knife he had ever seen. Zoro continued his walk through the gridlock of Manhattan. The sensation of this world was oppressive. The air was thin and tasted of chemical exhaust. The people were loud, but their voices carried no haki, no spirit. They were hollow, distracted, staring at glowing rectangles in their hands. He passed giant screens in Times Square, displaying the face of a man in a star-spangled cape, smiling a smile that Zoro instantly recognized as false. It was the smile of a noble or a celestial dragon, someone who believed they were owed worship. Zoro spat on the ground. He needed a drink. He found a bar on 8th Avenue, a dive with a neon sign buzzing ominously. He walked in, the heavy door slamming behind him. The patrons froze. The news was already out. Everyone had seen the footage of the samurai terrorist. The bartender reached for a shotgun under the counter. Zoro ignored the tension. He sat at a stool, the wood creaking under his density, and placed Wado Ichimonji on the counter. He asked for sake. The bartender, trembling, said they only had beer and whiskey. Zoro grunted and asked for the strongest thing they had. As the bartender poured a glass of cheap rye with shaking hands, the wall behind Zoro exploded. The attack came from the street. A tactical vehicle mounted with a sonic cannon had fired a focused pulse of concussive sound designed to incapacitate Supes with enhanced hearing. The front of the bar disintegrated. Glass, wood, and brick turned into shrapnel. The patrons were thrown against the back wall, bleeding and unconscious. Zoro sat on his stool, which was now the only piece of furniture standing in the wreckage. He held the glass of whiskey, shielding it with his hand so no dust would fall into it. The liquid rippled but did not spill. He turned slowly to face the hole in the wall. The sonic cannon was whining, charging for a second burst. Behind it stood 3 figures. Vought had sent the cleanup crew. There was Shockwave, a speedster trying to claw his way into the Seven. Gunpowder, a marksman with projectile manipulation abilities. And Black Noir, silent, standing perfectly still, his knives drawn. Zoro downed the whiskey in one gulp. It was terrible. It tasted like watered-down medicine. He stood up, grabbing his sword. He stepped out of the ruins of the bar onto the street, where the NYPD had cordoned off a 3-block radius. The media helicopters hovered overhead, broadcasting the standoff to the world. Shockwave moved first. He was fast, faster than the eye could track, a blur of kinetic energy meant to overwhelm opponents before they could react. In the boys' universe, speedsters were kings. If you couldn't see them, you died. Shockwave aimed a supersonic punch at Zoro's jaw, intending to shatter the bone and knock the terrorist out for a quick PR victory. Zoro did not need to see with his eyes. The color of observation, Kenbun Shoku Haki, painted the world in a 360-degree sphere of intent. He felt Shockwave's spirit flaring before the man even twitched a muscle. He felt the desperation, the arrogance, and the linear trajectory of the attack. To Zoro, Shockwave was not fast. He was loud. As Shockwave closed the distance, Zoro shifted his weight. He didn't draw a blade. He simply stepped into the path of the speedster and extended his leg. It was a trip. A basic schoolyard trip, timed with the precognitive precision of a master combatant. Shockwave, moving at Mach 2, hit Zoro's shin. The laws of inertia took over. The speedster's leg stopped instantly, but his upper body continued moving at supersonic speeds. The result was catastrophic. Shockwave flipped, spinning violently in the air, and crashed into a parked bus with enough force to fold the vehicle in half. He lay in the wreckage, groaning, his legs shattered by the impact with the immovable object that was Roronoa Zoro. Gunpowder reacted instantly, firing his custom high-caliber pistol. He could curve bullets, ricochet them around corners, and hit targets with impossible accuracy. He fired 3 shots, aiming for the gaps in Zoro's armor, for the eyes, for the throat. Zoro drew Kitetsu 3. He did not swing wild. He moved the blade in a blur of precision, slicing the bullets out of the air. Clang, clang, clang. The severed lead fragments tinkled onto the pavement. Gunpowder froze. He had seen Supes tank bullets. He had never seen someone cut them. The psychological shock was evident on his face. He reloaded, screaming, firing a continuous stream of lead. Zoro began to walk forward, deflecting each round with a casual, almost rhythmic flick of his wrist. He was closing the distance. Then, Black Noir struck. Noir was different. He was a silent killer, enhanced, skilled, and possessing a degree of super strength and durability that put him near the top of the food chain. He dropped from a lamppost, dual combat knives aimed at Zoro's neck. There was no killing intent leaking from Noir. He was a void, empty of emotion. This surprised Zoro. It reminded him of the assassin CP9 agents, but with less technique and more brute force. Zoro blocked the knives with Wado Ichimonji. The impact cracked the pavement beneath them. Noir was strong, surprisingly strong. He pushed against the blade, his silent mask inches from Zoro's face. Zoro grinned. Finally, something with a bit of backbone. Zoro shoved Noir back, creating space. Noir landed a backflip and immediately threw a flurry of shurikens, followed by a rush attack. Zoro parried, parried, parried. The sound of steel on steel rang out like church bells. To the world watching, it was a blur of motion. To Zoro, it was a warm-up. He analyzed Noir's fighting style, efficient, brutal, reliant on regeneration and pain tolerance. Noir didn't care if he got cut. Zoro decided to test that theory. He assumed a stance, 2 swords in hand. Nitoryu, nigiri. He swung. The air pressure alone knocked Gunpowder off his feet. 2 distinct slashes of compressed air, blue and sharp, tore through the street. Noir crossed his arms to block, his bracers made of Vought proprietary alloy. The attack, Toro, climbing tower, hit Noir. The Vought alloy shattered. Noir was launched backward, crashing through the brick facade of a deli, then the back wall, then the wall of the building behind it. He was buried under tons of rubble. Zoro sheathed his swords. He looked at Gunpowder, who was trembling on the ground, his weapon forgotten. Zoro pointed a finger at him. "You, where do I get a map?" Gunpowder couldn't speak. He just pointed north towards the library. or maybe just away from himself. The silence that followed was heavy. The police had stopped firing. The news choppers were hovering higher, afraid of the air pressure Zoro generated. In the Vought boardroom, there was dead silence. Stan Edgar adjusted his glasses. Homelander was no longer smiling. His face was a mask of cold, confused rage. They had just watched a man without a costume, without a code name, dismantle a strike team and brutalize 2 high-tier Supes in under 60 seconds. And he hadn't even taken the bandana off his arm. Zoro began walking again. The direction gunpowder pointed happened to lead toward the harbor. He wanted to find a boat. He wanted to get out of this noisy, stinking island. But as he walked, he felt something else. A massive, towering presence of malice was approaching from the sky. It wasn't the fake smile man on the screens. It was something deeper. It was the realization that the world itself was reacting to him. The breath of all things here was jagged. The stone he walked on didn't sing. It screamed. The steel in the buildings was mined from a tortured earth. This universe was sick. Zoro felt a headache coming on. He realized that finding a ship might not be enough. He might have to cut the sickness out of this place before he could leave. He turned a corner and ran into a man in a long trench coat. Billy Butcher stood there, holding a crowbar, not as a weapon, but as a prop to look casual. Huey was behind him, looking like he was about to vomit. Butcher looked at the swordsman, looked at the destruction behind him, and then looked him in the eye. "Oi, sunshine," Butcher said, his accent thick and mocking. "You look like you're having a rough day. Fancy a pint that doesn't explode." Zoro looked at Butcher. He sensed the man's spirit. It was black, tar-like, filled with rage and grief. It was similar to the eyes of a man who had lost his crew. Zoro paused. He didn't trust this man, but he understood him. "If you're buying," Zoro said. "I'm buying," Butcher replied, a dark smile spreading across his face. "And then we're going to have a little chat about the cunts in the tower you just pissed off. A temporary alliance, forged not in trust, but in the mutual recognition of violence. The board was set. Vought had a monster they couldn't control. Butcher had a weapon he didn't understand, and Zoro just wanted a drink and a nap, unaware that his mere presence was about to unravel the genetic tyranny of an entire timeline. The sun began to set over New York, casting long, bloody shadows through the gaps in the skyline, shadows that seemed to stretch out like grasping hands. The timeline had stopped bleeding and started to rot. The infection of freedom had arrived. The news cycle shifted instantly. The narrative of super-terrorist was cemented. Vought stock plummeted 12% in after-hours trading. In the depths of Vought Tower, in the secure lab, scientists were analyzing the blood Zoro had left on the pavement. The blood from his old wounds, not new ones. They put it under the microscope. They didn't find compound 5. They found cells that were vibrating, generating their own bioelectricity. Cells that refused to die even when separated from the host. They found something that defied biology. They found the will of D hidden in the genetic structure of a man who served it, and the sample began to consume the petri dish. This was the first irreversible catastrophe, not the damage to the building, but the introduction of a biological impossibility into a sterile system. The boy's universe was a closed loop of cause and effect, of drugs and money. Zoro was a chaotic variable. As he walked away with Butcher, the camera on a nearby lamppost zoomed in on his face. The image was frozen, digitized, and sent to a private server in Russia, to a hidden base in the Arctic, and to the desk of the president. The question on everyone's screen was the same. What is he? Zoro didn't know he was being watched. He was busy arguing with Butcher about the direction of the nearest pub. They were walking east. Butcher said the pub was west. Zoro insisted his gut said east. They walked east, directly toward the harbor, directly toward the Deep, who had been deployed to intercept them in the water. The comedy of his direction sense was the only thing that remained intact. But here, it wasn't funny. It was a tactical nightmare for anyone trying to predict his movements. It led him not where he wanted to go, but where the conflict was. Fate, it seemed, was also lost, and it was following him. The walk to the harbor was a slow parade of tension that cut through the rotting heart of the city's industrial district. Roronoa Zoro walked with a heavy, rhythmic gait, his boots scraping against the concrete with a sound that seemed to echo louder than the distant sirens. Beside him, Billy Butcher kept pace, his trench coat flapping in the wind, a crowbar still loosely gripped in his right hand. The Englishman was silent for the first 3 blocks, his mind racing through a catalogue of worst-case scenarios and tactical opportunities. He watched the swordsman from the corner of his eye, noting the lack of sweat, the steady breathing, and the way the man's single visible eye scanned the rooftops not with fear, but with the boredom of a predator waiting for better prey. Behind them, Huey Campbell and Frenchie trailed by 10 paces, whispering frantically about radiation signatures and biological anomalies. The air smelled of salt and diesel, a familiar scent to Zoro, though here it was tainted with a chemical sharpness that made his nose wrinkle. Butcher finally broke the silence, his voice rough and layered with a feigned casualness. He asked Zoro what compound he was running on, fishing for the brand name of the drug that could allow a man to cut bullets out of the air. Zoro did not stop walking. He simply grunted and said he preferred sake, but Ali would do. Butcher pressed, his charm thinning to reveal the interrogator beneath. He mentioned Vought, he mentioned the 7, he mentioned the concept of collateral damage. Zoro stopped then, turning his head slowly to look at the man. He told Butcher that he didn't know who Vought was, but if they were the ones stopping him from getting a drink, he would cut them. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered without bravado. Butcher stared at him, realized the man was either insane or telling the truth, and decided that either option was useful. He grinned, a shark-like expression, and pointed toward a flickering sign near the water's edge. They entered the warehouse district near the Chelsea piers. The sun had fully set, and the sodium vapor streetlights cast everything in a sickly orange glow. The water of the Hudson River was black and oily, slapping against the rotting pilings of the docks. Zoro felt the presence of the ocean, but it felt dead here. There was no song of the sea, only the heavy, muffled pressure of pollution and containment. He placed a hand on the hilt of Wado Ichimonji. The blade hummed, a low-frequency vibration that warned him of intent. Someone was in the water, not a fish. Something that thought it was a fish. The attack did not come from the street. It erupted from the river itself. A massive column of water, pressurized to the density of concrete, blasted over the edge of the pier, smashing through a stack of shipping containers and flooding the street in an instant. The boys scrambled back, Frenchie dragging Huey behind a concrete barrier. Butcher stood his ground for a second longer before diving behind a forklift. Zoro did not move. The water crashed over him, a torrent of freezing, filthy sludge. When the wave receded, he was still standing, soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked annoyed. From the dark water, a figure emerged, rising on a platform of riding surf that defied the calmness of the river. The Deep stood there, resplendent in his green and gold scale suit, his gills fluttering on his torso with agitated energy. He had been deployed by Vought with specific instructions. Drag the target into the water where the swords would be useless. The deep raised his hands, commanding the water, commanding the marine life. He shouted that this was his domain, that the ocean answered to the seven, and that the terrorist was trespassing on sacred ground. Zoro wrung out the hem of his shirt, squeezing a stream of dirty river water onto the pavement. He looked at the man in the fish costume. He looked at the gills. He felt the spirit of the man, weak, insecure, desperate for approval. It was pathetic. This was not a fishman. This was a human playing dress-up. Zoro asked if the man was a calamari dealer. The deep, insulted and fueled by the adrenaline of a public fight, screamed a command. Two great white sharks, tagged with Vought tracking chips and pumped full of aggression hormones, breached the water, launching themselves onto the pier with thrashing violence, aiming to drag Zoro into the depths. It was a horrifying sight for the civilians watching from the high-rise windows. Primitive nature weaponized by corporate science. Zoro did not draw a sword. He simply glared. He projected a burst of Haoshoku Haki, the color of the Supreme King. It was not a wide blast. It was a focused needle of will, directed solely at the biological entities in front of him. The air turned cold. The orange streetlights seemed to dim. The sharks, mid-thrash, froze. Their eyes rolled back into their heads, and they went limp, sliding harmlessly across the wet asphalt to rest at Zoro's feet. The deep gasped, clutching his chest. He felt the pressure. It wasn't physical force. It was the sensation of being in the presence of an apex predator that viewed him as food. His connection to the ocean, usually a source of comfort, suddenly screamed at him to run. The water in the Hudson seemed to recoil from the swordsman. Zoro stepped forward. He told the fishman to get out of the way. The deep, terrified and confused, tried to summon a water blast, but his hands shook uncontrollably. He had bullied criminals. He had abused his status, but he had never stood before a creature that had conquered the Grand Line. Zoro walked past him. As he passed, he tapped the hilt of his sword against the deep's shoulder. The deep collapsed to his knees, vomiting salt water, his mind unable to process the sheer weight of the aura that had just walked by. The camera drones hovering overhead captured the image. A member of the Seven, broken without a single blow being struck. Butcher watched from behind the forklift, his eyes wide. He had seen Supes terrified of Homelander. He had never seen a Supe terrified of a human. He realized then that Zoro's power wasn't a mutation. It was something else. It was an imposition of reality. He signaled the team to move. They needed to get this weapon underground before the heavy hitter arrived. But it was too late. The air pressure changed again. This time, it wasn't the vacuum of a vacuum slice. It was the arrival of a god. A sonic boom shattered the windows of every building within a 3-block radius. The wind kicked up into a hurricane gale as a figure descended from the clouds, hovering 20 feet above the street. Homelander had arrived. His cape fluttered immaculately. His eyes glowed with twin points of red death. He did not look at the deep, who was still retching on the ground. He looked at Zoro. The silence that descended was absolute. The siren stopped. The shouting stopped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Homelander floated down until his boots touched the pavement. He smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. He spoke with the condescending patience of a disappointed father. He told Zoro that he had made a mess. He told him that breaking his tower was very rude. He asked if Zoro knew who he was. Zoro looked at the man in the cape. He sensed the power immediately. This man was strong, stronger than the fish, stronger than the soldiers. His spirit was a raging inferno of narcissism and unearned divinity. But underneath the power, Zoro smelled the same thing he smelled on the celestial dragons: fragility. A man who had never been cut. A man who had never lost. Zoro put his hand on Wado Ichimonji again. He told Homelander he didn't care who he was, and asked if he had any booze. Homelander's eye twitched. The disrespect was alien to him. He was the Homelander. People cried when they saw him. They prayed. They didn't ask for alcohol. The narcissist injury triggered an immediate, lethal response. Homelander didn't monologue further. He simply fired. 2 beams of concentrated heat vision, hot enough to slice through an aircraft carrier, erupted from his eyes. They traveled at the speed of light, aiming directly for Zoro's chest. In the logic of the Vought universe, the fight ended there. The target would be bisected, cauterized, and the hero would fly away. Zoro drew. It was not a block. It was an interception. Wado Ichimonji, coated in the invisible armor of Busoshoku Haki, met the laser beams. The collision produced a sound that was not of this earth, a high-pitched shrieking of energy warring with spiritual density. A sphere of superheated plasma expanded from the point of impact, vaporizing the asphalt, the water on the ground, and the glass of the nearest storefronts. The light was blinding, turning the night into a whiteout. When the light faded, Zoro was sliding backward, his boots carving deep trenches into the street. Smoke rose from his blade. His arms were shaking slightly. He had stopped the beams, but the kinetic force was immense. He grinned. He clenched the sword between his teeth and drew the other 2. Sandai Kitetsu and Enma joined the fray. The demonic aura of Enma flared purple, hungry for the massive energy source floating in front of it. Homelander stared. For the first time in his life, his lasers had not worked. He looked at the man, then at the sword. Confusion warred with rage. He floated forward and threw a punch. It was a punch that could topple a skyscraper. Zoro dodged, the wind of the blow tearing the sleeve off his shirt. Zoro countered, a 3-sword style strike. Onigiri. He blurred past Homelander, striking the hero's chest. The impact sent a shockwave through the district that shattered the windows of the Chelsea market. Homelander was knocked back, flying through the air and crashing into a brick warehouse wall, bringing the entire structure down on top of him. The world stopped. Civilians filming from rooftops gasped. Butcher dropped his cigarette. Homelander had been hit. Homelander had been moved. The rubble exploded outward. Homelander rose, his suit torn, his cape dusty. He touched his chest. There was a thin red line across the blue fabric. It wasn't a deep cut. It was a scratch. But it was blood. A single drop of bright red blood welled up and trickled down his chest. Homelander looked at the blood on his finger. His face went pale, then red, then a color that didn't exist in nature. He began to scream. It was a scream of pure, infantile rage. He launched himself at Zoro, abandoning all technique, flying at Mach speeds, throwing punches, lasers, and kicks in a frenzy of violence. Zoro met him. The fight that ensued destroyed the waterfront. It was a clash of 2 incompatible physics engines. Homelander was fast, durable, and infinitely strong, but he fought like a brawler who had never needed to block. Zoro was a master technician, reading every movement, deflecting blows that would have pulped his organs, and landing cuts that grew deeper with every pass. Enma was drawing more and more Haki, forcing Zoro to focus to keep the sword from draining his life force. The catastrophe happened when Homelander, frustrated by his inability to land a killing blow, flew into the sky and nosedived, intending to create a crater that would swallow the island. He came down like a meteor. Zoro sheathed his swords, crouched, and waited. He breathed in, the breath of all things. He heard the steel of the city, the water of the river, the blood of the tyrant. Santoryu Ogi, Ichidai Sanzen, Daisen Sekai. Zoro spun, meeting the meteor with the 3,000 worlds. The impact occurred 20 feet above the ground. The shockwave was horizontal. It sliced the air for 3 miles. The Chelsea Piers complex was bisected. The upper half of 3 warehouses simply slid off their foundations and fell into the river. The force of the blow negated Homelander's momentum, stopping him cold in the air. The hero was thrown upward, spinning uncontrollably, crashing into the side of a distant skyscraper. Zoro landed on his knees, panting. Blood dripped from his nose. His stamina was draining fast. This world's lack of ambient Haki made recovery difficult. He looked at his swords. They were chipped. Not broken, but chipped. The material of this world, and the man he was fighting, was unnaturally dense. Homelander did not return immediately. He was embedded in the side of the building, staring at the deep gash across his chest. It was real. Mortality was real. Fear, cold and unfamiliar, gripped his heart. He didn't know how to process it. He stayed there, shivering, as the cameras zoomed in on his wound. The image was beamed to every screen on Earth. The god bleeding, the god afraid. Butcher ran to Zoro. He didn't offer a hand. He offered an escape route. He grabbed Zoro's arm, shouting that the National Guard was 5 minutes out and Vought would drop a nuke if they had to. Zoro tried to argue, tried to say he wasn't done, but his legs gave way. The exhaustion of dimension crossing combined with the drain of Enma was too much. He stumbled. Frenchie pulled up in a stolen van, tires screeching. They shoved the swordsman into the back. As the van sped away, weaving through the chaos of the destroyed district, Zoro looked out the back window. He saw the devastation. He saw the fear in the eyes of the people running. He realized this wasn't a duel. This was a war zone, and he had just declared war on the planet's idol. The van disappeared into the night, heading for a safe house in the Bronx. Back at the waterfront, the dust settled. Stan Edgar watched the footage from his office. He didn't look angry. He looked fascinated. He picked up his phone and dialed a number that hadn't been used since the Cold War. Vought had a contingency for everything, but they didn't have a contingency for this. They needed outside help. They needed to understand the energy source that could cut invulnerability. The irreversible fracture of the Vought mythos. The illusion of safety was gone. The public had seen their savior bleed. The boys had a weapon that could kill God, but the weapon was comatose in the back of a van, muttering about becoming the king of hell. The geopolitical landscape shifted overnight. Nations that had bowed to Vought began to mobilize their own intelligence agencies. If Homelander could bleed, he could die. And if he could die, the power vacuum would be apocalyptic. In the darkness of the van, Zoro dreamt. He dreamt of Quina. He dreamt of Mihawk. He dreamt of a world where power was honest. He woke up with a start as the van hit a pothole. He looked at Butcher, who was cleaning his gun. "Where's the booze?" Zoro rasped. Butcher threw him a flask of cheap vodka. "Welcome to the Resistance, you green-haired twat." Zoro drank. It burned. It was good. He closed his eye again. The war had started, and he was already tired of the politics. He just wanted to know if the man in the cape would come back for round 2. He hoped so. He hadn't used his bandana yet. The systemic clash had begun. The existence of Haki, of spiritual will manifest as power, was now a known variable in a world of biological determinism. Scientists were already theorizing. Philosophers were already debating. If a man could cut a god through sheer will, what did that say about the source of power? Was Vaught's drug just a cheap imitation of true strength? The ideological rot began to spread faster than any virus. The timeline was not just broken, it was being rewritten, and in the shadows, other entities, things older and darker than Vought, began to stir, drawn by the scent of a soul that burned like a sun. The narrative momentum had shifted from intrusion to revolution. The question was no longer what Vought would do to Zoro, but what the world would do with the knowledge that Vought was fraudulent. The cost of this knowledge was the stability of civilization. As the van drove north, the lights of the city seemed to flicker, as if the grid itself was unsure of its future. The era of the Supes was ending. The era of the swordsman had begun. But the transition would be ridden in blood, and most of it would not be Supes. It would be the blood of the millions caught between a falling empire and a rising tide. The van turned a corner, and the skyline vanished, replaced by the grim reality of the burrows. The game had changed. Silence fell over the group, heavy and suffocating. They were alive, but for how long? The answer lay in the scabbards resting against Zoro's hip, and in the terrified, hateful heart of the man floating above the ruins of the pier. The escalation was inevitable. The next time they met, the city would not survive. The damp subterranean air of the Bronx safe house smelled of mold, cat urine, and the copper tang of dried blood. It was a derelict subway maintenance station, abandoned in the 80s and repurposed by the boys into a bunker of paranoia and tactical improvisation. Roronoa Zoro sat on a rusted crate in the center of the main chamber, his torso wrapped in bandages that were already soaking through with fresh red stains. He was not asleep. He was in a state of meditative trance, a technique drilled into him by the greatest swordsman of his own world, designed to force the body to knit flesh together through sheer concentration. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was annoying, a constant electric buzzing that grated against his heightened senses. But it was the silence of the men around him that felt heavier. They were watching him. They were watching him like a bomb that had stopped ticking but had not yet exploded. Frenchie was huddled over a workbench in the corner, his goggles reflecting the blue light of a microscope. He was vibrating with a mix of chemical excitement and existential terror. He had taken a sample of Zoro's blood from the van floor, and what he was seeing defied every lesson of biology he had learned in his life, of weapons manufacturing and drug synthesis. In the Vought universe, power came from Compound 5, a specific blue isotope that rewrote DNA, enhancing muscle density, sensory input, and durability. It was a physical additive, a steroid on a God-complex scale. But the cells under Frenchie's microscope contained no V. They contained no foreign chemical agents. Instead, they were vibrating. The mitochondria were generating an energy output that shouldn't be possible for a biological organism. A bioelectric field that seemed to react to observation. When Frenchie looked at it with fear, the cells agitated. When he calmed his breathing, they slowed. It was responsive matter. It was will made manifest in meat. Billy Butcher leaned against a concrete pillar, nursing a warm beer and watching the swordsman. The Englishman's mind was a tactical map of New York, and every route was currently blocked by the psychological fallout of what had happened at the pier. He had spent years trying to find a weapon that could kill a Supe. He had built bombs, blackmailed politicians, and injected himself with unstable filth, all to scratch the paint of the Seven. And now, a man with moss for hair and zero navigational skills had walked out of a rift and put the fear of mortality into the Homelander. Butcher took a swig of the beer, his eyes cold. He didn't care about the magic. He didn't care about the glowing swords. He cared about the vector. He needed to point this vector at Vought Tower and pull the trigger before the vector decided to wander off for a nap. Zoro opened his single eye. The room temperature seemed to drop. He exhaled, a visible plume of steam rising from his lips despite the warmth of the basement. He touched the hilt of Enma. The sword was quiet now, satiated by the clash with the laser eyes, but it was heavy. This world was draining. The atmospheric Haki here was non-existent. In the Grand Line, the air was thick with the clash of ambitions, a spiritual ecosystem that a warrior could draw upon. Here, the air was empty. It was a spiritual vacuum. Every ounce of power Zoro used had to be generated entirely from his own core, burning his calories and life force at an accelerated rate. He was hungry, not just for food, but for a challenge that made sense. Butcher stepped forward, the heels of his boots clicking on the concrete. He tossed a bag of fast food burgers at Zoro's feet. Zoro looked at the bag, smelled the grease and the processed chemicals, and frowned. He tore it open anyway, eating 3 burgers in 2 bites, wrapper and all for one of them. He needed the fuel. Butcher started talking, his voice low and grinding. He laid out the situation. Vought had locked down Manhattan. The National Guard was mobilizing, but they were under Vought command. The narrative on the news was that Zoro was a biological weapon released by a foreign power, a super terrorist carrying a contagious pathogen that caused hallucinations. They were clearing the streets. They were hunting. Zoro chewed, swallowing the dry bread. He asked if there was any sake. Butcher ignored the request and pressed the issue. He told Zoro that they had a window. Homelander was hurt. He was scared. He would be unstable. If they struck now, while the Force God was bleeding, they could end it. Butcher wanted to hit the Vought pharmaceutical distribution centers in New Jersey. He wanted to cut the supply of V. He wanted Zoro to be the distraction while the boys planted the explosives. It was a solid plan. It was a guerrilla tactic. Zoro wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked at Butcher and told him no. The refusal was flat, without anger. Butcher froze, his jaw tightening. He asked why. Zoro explained that he wasn't an assassin. He wasn't a soldier in their war. He was a pirate. He had a captain, and Butcher wasn't him. He had a goal, and blowing up warehouses wasn't it. He was going to find a ship, and he was going to leave this cursed island. If anyone stood in his way, he would cut them. If the man in the cape came back, he would cut him too. But he wouldn't sneak around in the dark planting bombs like a rat. The tension in the room spiked. Mother's Milk, who had been cleaning a rifle, stood up slowly. Huey looked between the 2 men, sensing the violence in the air. Butcher's hand drifted toward the crowbar on his belt. He didn't like being told no. He especially didn't like being told no by a weapon he felt he had ownership of. He stepped closer to Zoro, invading his personal space, his eyes burning with the madness of a man who had nothing left to lose. He called Zoro a coward. He told him that he had started a fire he couldn't walk away from. He told him that Vought wouldn't let him leave, that they would hunt him to the ends of the earth, that they would kill everyone he asked for directions. Zoro didn't blink. He looked up at Butcher, and for a second, the darkness of the basement seemed to warp around him. He released a sliver of killing intent, a fraction of the pressure he used to tame the king of hell. Butcher flinched. It was involuntary. His body reacted before his mind could, his muscles locking up in the presence of a superior predator. Zoro told him to sit down before he got hurt. Butcher stood there, trembling with rage, but he didn't swing. He sat down. At Vought Tower, the atmosphere was one of sterile panic. The conference room was being repaired, workers silently replacing the glass, while the seven sat around the table. The mood was funeral. Homelander was absent. He was in his private quarters, refusing to come out, refusing to speak to the marketing team. Stan Edgar sat at the head of the table, his demeanor unchanged, his pulse steady. He was looking at a tablet displaying the engagement metrics. The public was confused. The footage of Homelander bleeding had been scrubbed from the internet, but it was still circulating on the dark web, on encrypted apps, on the streets. The myth of invincibility had been punctured. Edgar knew that fear was a currency, and right now, Vought was experiencing hyperinflation. He looked at the remaining members of the seven. Queen Maeve looked tired, her eyes distant. A-Train was vibrating with nervous energy, nursing his leg. The Deep was in the hospital, suffering from severe psychological trauma and dehydration. Black Noir was in critical condition, his regenerative factors struggling to knit bones that had been pulverized by compressed air. Edgar needed a solution that didn't involve Homelander. He needed to prove that Vaught's systems were superior to this anomaly. He needed to reframe the conflict. It wasn't a fight between a hero and a villain. It was a fight between order and chaos. Edgar activated the hologram in the center of the table. It displayed a tactical map of the Bronx. He authorized the deployment of Operation Whitewash. It was a scorched earth protocol. They wouldn't send a superhero to duel the swordsman. That was a mistake. They would send the weight of the military-industrial complex. They would send the Vought private militia, equipped with experimental sonic weaponry, neurotoxin gas, and drone swarms. And they would send Maeve and A-Train not to fight, but to herd the target into a kill box where a tactical nuclear yield, disguised as a gas main explosion, could be applied. Collateral damage was acceptable. The Bronx was expendable. The stock price was not. Back in the safe house, the air changed. Zoro's head snapped up. His observation Haki, usually a sphere of awareness, suddenly spiked with 1,000 pinpricks of distress. He felt it before he heard it. The screams, the fear. Not the fear of a few men, but the fear of a neighborhood. Vought had begun the purge. Above ground, black armored trucks were rolling through the streets of the South Bronx. Soldiers in gas masks were kicking down doors, dragging families out of their homes. They were setting up a perimeter. They were releasing the gas. It was a heavy yellow neurotoxin designed to incapacitate Supes by overloading their nervous systems. To humans, it was agonizing. It caused blindness, seizures, and the sensation of burning skin. The gas rolled down the subway stairs, seeping into the ventilation shafts. Frenchie smelled it first. He shouted a warning, scrambling for gas masks. Butcher grabbed his gear, his face hardening. He knew this play. It was a classic Vought cleanup. No witnesses. Zoro stood up. He grabbed his swords. He didn't put on a mask. He walked toward the exit stairs. Butcher grabbed his shoulder, shouting that it was a trap, that the air was poison, that they needed to go deeper into the tunnels to escape. Zoro looked at the hand on his shoulder, then at the ceiling. He told Butcher that he could hear them. He could hear the children choking. He could hear the old people falling. He said that a man who abandons the weak to save his own skin is not a man. Zoro shrugged off Butcher's hand and walked up the stairs. The gas hit him. It burned his eyes. It burned his lungs. It was chemical warfare designed to drop an elephant. Zoro coughed, retching, but he didn't stop. He forced his will into his lungs. He used Haki to coat the inside of his trachea. a desperate, impossible application of armor to internal organs. It wasn't perfect, but it bought him time. He kicked the steel door open and stepped out into the night. The street was a hellscape. Yellow fog swirled knee-deep. Civilians were running, coughing, collapsing. Vought soldiers were shooting anyone who didn't comply. Drones hovered overhead, their spotlights cutting through the gloom. A tank was rolling down the avenue, its turret turning toward the subway entrance. Zoro drew Sandai Kitetsu. The cursed blade pulsed, feeding on the misery in the air. Zoro didn't wait. He didn't monologue. He moved. He vanished from the doorway and reappeared on top of the tank. He drove the sword down through the turret, through the armor, through the engine block. The tank stopped dead. Zoro kicked the hatch open, grabbed the gunner, and threw him into a pile of garbage bags. He stood on the ruined vehicle, the gas swirling around him, and roared. It was a challenge, a beacon. He wanted them to look at him. He wanted them to stop hurting the people and look at the monster. The Vought forces turned. A squad of soldiers opened fire. Bullets sparked against the tank, against Zoro's swords. He deflected them, sending them into the tires of the trucks, into the drones. He was a whirlwind of steel, but the gas was getting to him. His vision blurred. His limbs felt heavy. This wasn't a fight against a warrior. It was a fight against chemistry. Then the blur arrived. A-Train had been waiting on the rooftops. He saw the swordsman stumble. He saw the opening. He didn't care about honor. He cared about getting back into the Seven. He needed a win. He ignited his compound Vi-fueled metabolism and ran. He moved at Mach 3, a human missile. He aimed for Zoro's sword arm, intending to snap the bone before the nerve impulse could travel from Zoro's brain to his hand. Zoro didn't see him. The gas had blinded his eyes. But the color of observation did not rely on light. It relied on intent. And A-Train's intent was so loud, so desperate, that it screamed like a siren in Zoro's mind. Zoro didn't swing. He simply shifted his weight. He dropped into a low stance, placing Wado Ichimonji in the path of the speedster. It was a prediction of geometry. A-Train, moving too fast to correct his course, ran directly into the flat of the blade. The impact was like a car hitting a wall. A-Train's femur snapped with a sound like a gunshot. He tumbled, cartwheeling across the pavement, crashing into a storefront. He screamed, clutching his leg, the same leg that had been broken before, now shattered again by the immovable object of Zoro's defense. Zoro coughed blood. The gas was working. He swayed. From the sky, Queen Maeve descended. She landed softly, her sword drawn. She wore her Amazonian armor, her face a mask of conflict. She saw the carnage. She saw the soldiers gassing civilians. She saw the swordsman, poisoned, bleeding, standing on a tank protecting the subway entrance. She looked at A-Train writhing in the dirt. Stan Edgar's voice crackled in her earpiece. "Finish him, Maeve. He is weak. Cut his head off." Maeve looked at Zoro. Zoro looked at her. He saw a warrior. He saw someone who knew how to hold a blade. He smiled, a bloody, feral grin. He adjusted his grip. He told her to come. He told her he had one good swing left. Maeve took a step forward. She raised her sword. This was the moment. She could end the threat. She could save Vought. She could go back to her life of hollow celebrity and self-loathing. She looked at the civilians cowering behind the tank. She looked at the gas mask on her own face. She threw her sword on the ground. The clang echoed in the silence. Stan Edgar, watching the feed, went still. Maeve ripped the earpiece out of her ear and crushed it. She walked over to Zoro. She didn't attack. She stood beside him, facing the Vought soldiers. She faced the tyranny of her own creators. "I'm not doing this," she said. her voice projecting over the sound of the drones. "Call off the gas." The soldiers hesitated. This was Queen Maeve. This was the second most powerful being on the planet, and she was standing with a terrorist. The chain of command fractured. But the systems of the Vought universe were not built on loyalty. They were built on contingencies. High above the Bronx, a drone operator in a secure bunker received a new code, Protocol Omega. If the assets go rogue, sterilize the board. The drone swarm overhead stopped filming and armed their payloads. These weren't missiles. They were thermobaric charges designed to suck the oxygen out of the air and incinerate everything within a 4-block radius. Zoro looked up. He felt the shift in the sky. He felt the death coming down. He looked at Maeve. He looked at the subway entrance where the boys were hiding, where the civilians were huddled. He knew he couldn't cut an explosion that big. Not in this state. Not with poison in his blood. He sheathed his swords. He grabbed Maeve by the arm and threw her toward the subway. "Get them down," he roared. Maeve stumbled, looking back. "What are you doing?" Zoro stripped off his green coat. He tied his black bandana around his head. The atmosphere shifted. The gas seemed to be pushed away by the sheer pressure of his rising Haki. His skin turned black, coated entirely in armament. He wasn't going to cut the bomb. He was going to catch it. The drones fired. 12 thermobaric warheads dropped in unison, streaking toward the intersection. Zoro crouched. He placed his hands on the ground. He channeled every ounce of spirit, every memory of training, every ambition to be the world's greatest. He didn't use a sword technique. He used a barrier technique he had seen once, long ago, improvised and fueled by desperation. Mushin, no, Kamai. The warheads detonated. The explosion was a miniature sun, a sphere of fire and pressure that should have erased the South Bronx. But it didn't expand. It hit a ceiling. It hit an invisible, impenetrable dome of will that Zoro projected upward. The fire raged against the Haki. The heat turned the asphalt to glass. Zoro stood in the center, his arms raised, his muscles tearing, his bones groaning under the weight of a skyscraper's worth of pressure. He screamed. It was a scream of absolute defiance against the physics of this universe. The fire burned for 10 seconds. Then it died. The smoke cleared. There was no crater. There was only a circle of scorched earth. And in the center, Roronoa Zoro stood. He was charred. His skin was smoking. He was unconscious, standing upright, his eyes rolled back, his arms still raised to the sky. He had tanked a saturation bombardment. He had saved the block. Silence returned to the Bronx. The soldiers lowered their weapons, terrified. This wasn't a Supe. This was a demon. Butcher emerged from the subway. He saw the statue of the swordsman. He walked over, checking for a pulse. It was faint, thready, but there. Butcher looked at the Vought cameras that were still rolling on the rooftops. He looked directly into the lens. He spat on the ground. "You'll move, cunts," he whispered. He signaled to Frenchie and MM. They grabbed Zoro's rigid body. Maeve helped them. They loaded him into the back of a stolen ambulance. They drove away, unchallenged. The Vought forces didn't pursue. They couldn't. Their morale was shattered. They had thrown the apocalypse at a man, and he had caught it with his bare hands. The escalation had reached its peak. The systems had clashed, and the anime logic, the logic that will supersedes physics, had proven superior, but at a terrible cost. Zoro was out of the fight. His body was broken. He needed time. He needed a doctor who understood monsters. And in the shadows of the CIA, Grace Mallory watched the footage and made a call. It was time to open the archives. It was time to bring in the only thing that might be able to wake him up. It was time to find out if the myths about Soldier Boy were true, or if they needed to look even further back to the legends of things that fell from the sky into the 1940s. The world had changed. The Bronx was a holy site now. People were gathering at the circle of scorched earth. They weren't lighting candles for Vought. They were leaving swords, small plastic swords, kitchen knives, sticks. It was a cult of the blade, rising from the ashes of the corporate god. The narrative war was lost. Vought had created a martyr who wasn't even dead. And in his tower, Homelander stared at his reflection, at the graying hair on his temple, and realized that he was aging. The timeline infection was spreading. The concept of limit had been introduced to a limitless being, and it was driving him insane. The next act would not be a battle. It would be a hunt, and the predator was no longer the man in the cape. It was the idea that he could be killed. The ambulance sped into the night, carrying the broken body of the pirate hunter. Butcher looked at Zoro's face. "Don't you die on me, you mosshead," he muttered. "We haven't even killed the big one yet." He opened a beer, his hand shaking. The systemic clash was over. The war for reality had just begun. The universe was bending, cracking, trying to accommodate the weight of a dream that refused to die. And somewhere, deep in the Atlantic Ocean, a massive shadow moved under the water, drawn by the echo of the Haki blast. Something ancient, something that remembered when the world was wild. The Sea Kings were waking up, but they weren't on the Grand Line. They were here, and they were hungry. The silence in the CIA black site, buried 300 feet beneath the granite bedrock of Vermont, was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a tomb waiting to be filled. The air recycling systems hummed with a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the steel floors, a sound that drove Billy Butcher to pace the length of the medical bay for the 4th hour in a row. Roronoa Zoro lay on the central operating table, hooked up to machinery that was designed to monitor heart rates and brain activity, but was currently registering data that looked like seismic readings from an active fault line. The swordsman was comatose, his body a map of charred flesh and deep purple bruising where the blood vessels had burst under the strain of containing a thermobaric explosion. He was not dying, but he was not healing in a way that made sense to the medical staff. His cells were not regenerating. They were warring. The biology of the One Piece world, fueled by meat and will, was fighting a violent immunological battle against the physics of a universe that insisted he should be dead. Frenchie sat by the monitors, his face illuminated by the cascading green data streams. He looked haggard, his eyes rimmed with the red, a half-empty cup of espresso trembling in his hand. He had spent the last 12 hours analyzing the blood sample he had taken from the van, and the results were terrifying him. He called Butcher over, his voice a whisper, as if he were afraid the universe might overhear the heresy he was about to speak. He pointed to the cellular structure on the screen. The mitochondria in Zoro's blood were not just producing energy. They were vibrating at a frequency that disrupted local gravity. Frenchie explained that this wasn't biology anymore. It was quantum imposition. The reason Zoro could cut steel or stand on air wasn't a mutation. It was because his cells were convinced that the laws of physics were suggestions, and more importantly, the sample was contagious, not to people, but to reality. The glass slide holding the blood was slowly turning into a black blade-like material. The matter around the blood was being converted to match the nature of the blood. Butcher stared at the screen, his mind working through the tactical implications with the cold ruthlessness that defined him. He didn't see a miracle. He saw a payload. If they could synthesize this effect, if they could bottle this will and inject it. They wouldn't just be able to kill Homelander. They could erase him. They could rewrite the script that Vought had forced down the world's throat for 50 years. Butcher looked at the unconscious swordsman, then at the vial of synthesized serum Frenchie had managed to distill, a glowing violet liquid that hummed with a low, menacing sound. It was the distillation of the king's Haki, stripped of the man and reduced to a chemical agent. Frenchie warned him that it was unstable, that they didn't know what it would do to a human physiology born in this dimension. Butcher didn't care. He saw a gun on the table, and he wanted to pull the trigger. 300 miles south, in the penthouse of Vought Tower, the concept of control was disintegrating. Homelander stood on the balcony, looking out at a city that no longer worshipped him. The streets of New York were empty, under a martial law curfew that he hadn't ordered. The news screens in Times Square were dark, or playing loop reels of emergency broadcasts. He could hear the hearts of the millions of people in the city. Usually, the rhythm was a soothing background noise of adoration and fear. Now, it was a chaotic drumbeat of doubt. They were whispering about the man in green. They were whispering that the gods could bleed. Homelander gripped the railing, his fingers sinking into the titanium alloy as if it were clay. He had spent his entire life in a laboratory or a television studio, told that he was the apex, the end of history. Now history had returned, and it carried 3 swords. Behind him, in the darkened living room, Stormfront watched him. She was battered, her regeneration slow, a relic of a past era that understood hate better than marketing. She didn't offer comfort. She offered ideology. She told him that he was letting a savage dictate the terms of engagement. She told him that the swordsman was an impurity, a biological error that needed to be purged not with lasers, but with an army. She revealed that Vought had been holding back. They had reserves. They had the test subjects from the Sage Grove Center that were too volatile for the public. They had the rejects. She proposed a scorched earth policy. Release the monsters. Create a threat so large, so uncontrollable, that the public would beg Homelander to save them, regardless of whether he bled or not. Chaos was the ladder, and she wanted him to climb it. Homelander listened, the red glow in his eyes fading into a cold, dead blue. He didn't want to save them anymore. He wanted to punish them for their lack of faith. He nodded. Deep in the Atlantic Ocean, on the edge of the continental shelf, the deep was swimming. He had fled the hospital, fled the tower, fled the mocking laughter of the internet. He sought the comfort of the abyss, the silence of the crushing depths where he was usually the king. But the ocean was not silent. It was screaming. The marine life was in a panic. Schools of tuna were beaching themselves on the Jersey shore. Whales were singing songs of distress that had no translation in modern marine biology. The deep swam deeper, his gills fluttering with anxiety. He felt a pressure building in the water, a heaviness that wasn't hydrostatic. It was the same pressure he had felt when the swordsman looked at him. He reached the edge of the shelf, looking down into the darkness of the trench, and then the darkness blinked. A massive golden eye opened in the abyss. It was the size of a stadium. It was reptilian, ancient, and filled with an intelligence that predated humanity. A low-frequency rumble moved through the water, vibrating the deep's bones. It wasn't a sound. It was a voice. The voice of all things. The Sea Kings had heard the call of the Conqueror in the Bronx. They had sensed the breach in the reality barrier. They were migrating, not from the Pacific, but from the spaces between dimensions. The deep stared into the eye of the beast, and his mind shattered. He realized that he was not the Lord of the Seven Seas. He was a gnat floating in a cup of water, and someone had just kicked the table. The beast rose, displacing megatons of water, heading toward the surface, drawn by the scent of the Haki that was still radiating from the unconscious body in Vermont. Back in the bunker, the moment of choice arrived. Butcher picked up the vial of violet serum. He looked at Huey, who was sleeping in a chair, exhausted. He looked at MM, who was arguing on the phone with his family. Butcher made a decision. He wasn't going to wait for Zoro to wake up. The swordsman was too unpredictable, too noble. He would take the power for himself. He rolled up his sleeve, tying off his arm with a rubber tube. He tapped the vein. He brought the needle to his skin. A hand gripped his wrist. The grip was iron. It was absolute. Butcher looked down. Zoro's hand had shot out from the operating table, grabbing him with enough force to bruise the bone. The swordsman's eye was open. It wasn't groggy. It was clear, sharp, and burning with a terrifying lucidness. Zoro sat up, tearing the sensors off his chest, the wires snapping and sparking. He didn't look at the machines. He looked at the vial in Butcher's hand. Zoro asked him what he was doing. His voice was a gravelly rumble that filled the room. Butcher tried to pull away, but he couldn't move his arm. He snarled that he was finishing the job, that he was taking the weapon they needed to win. He told Zoro that he was just a tourist, that he didn't understand the stakes. Zoro looked at the vial, sensing the twisted, synthesized nature of the liquid inside. It was Haki, yes, but it was Haki without spirit. It was ambition without effort. It was a poison that would consume the host. Zoro tightened his grip. The glass vial shattered. The violet liquid splashed onto the floor. Butcher roared in anger, swinging his free hand. Zoro caught the punch effortlessly. He looked Butcher in the eye and told him that power isn't something you inject. He said that a man who steals strength is already defeated. He told Butcher that if he used that poison, he wouldn't be a Kingslayer. He would be a slave to the drug. Butcher stared at him, breathing heavy, hate and shame warring in his eyes. He asked Zoro what the hell he knew about it. He asked Zoro if he knew what Homelander had done to his wife. Zoro let go of Butcher's arm. He swung his legs off the table, standing up. He swayed slightly, the bandages on his torso tight and restrictive. He picked up Wado Ichimonji from the side table. He told Butcher that he knew enough. He knew that a man who fights with hatred fights alone. And he knew that he was hungry. This was the small choice, the rejection of the shortcut. If Butcher had taken the serum, he might have gained the power to kill Homelander that night, but he would have become a monster that destroyed New York in the process. By shattering the vial, Zoro preserved Butcher's humanity for one more day. But he also did something far more dangerous. The liquid on the floor didn't evaporate. It burned a hole through the concrete. It seeped into the earth. It traveled down, through the bedrock, into the water table. The concentrated essence of a conqueror, rejected by the host but accepted by the planet, began to spread. The CIA bunker alarm screamed. The sensors picked up a massive thermal bloom approaching from the south. Vought had found them. Not by tracking a phone, but by tracking the energy release of the shattered vial. Stormfront had led the hunting party, and she hadn't come alone. The blast doors of the bunker shook. A massive impact dented the 3-inch steel. Then another. Then the metal began to melt. A beam of plasma cut through the door, and the screech of tearing metal filled the air. Vought tactical teams poured in, followed by the subject. It wasn't a human. It was a chimera. A genetically modified monstrosity from the depths of Vaught's labs. A creature with the durability of Black Noir and the energy projection of a nuclear reactor, stitched together and lobotomized to serve as a biological battering ram. Zoro looked at the creature. He looked at his swords. He was at 30% capacity. His body was still screaming from the Bronx. He looked at the boys. They were scrambling for weapons, terrified. This wasn't a fight they could win. This was a slaughter. Zoro made a tactical calculation. He couldn't protect them and fight the Chimera at the same time. The hallway was too narrow. The collateral damage would kill Huey and Frenchie instantly. He needed to take this outside. He needed to change the battlefield. He turned to Frenchie. He asked if there was a back exit. Frenchie pointed to a ventilation shaft that led to the surface, into the forest. Zoro nodded. He told them to run. He told them to get the van and drive north, away from the city. He would buy them time. Butcher hesitated. He looked at the shattered vial on the floor, then at the swordsman. For the first time, he didn't see a tool. He saw a man. He nodded, once, a sharp jerk of the head. "Give 'em hell, Mosshead," he muttered, and dragged Huey into the shaft. Zoro turned to the breach. The Chimera roared, a sound of distorted agony and rage. Stormfront floated in behind it, electricity arcing from her fingertips. She smiled when she saw him. She saw the bandages. She saw the fatigue. She thought she had won. Zoro tied the bandana around his head. He drew all three swords. He bit down on the hilt of Wado. He didn't speak. He simply let his spirit expand. The clash that followed destroyed the bunker. The energy released by the Chimera was radioactive. The cuts Zoro delivered were spatial. The mountain above them shook. Trees in the forest above were uprooted by the tremors. Zoro fought not to win, but to draw aggro. He led the monster up the elevator shaft, cutting handholds into the concrete, forcing the fight to the surface. He burst out into the moonlight of the Vermont forest, the Chimera hot on his heels. Stormfront followed, flying high, raining lightning down on the clearing. She laughed, taunting him, calling him a relic. She didn't realize that every bolt of lightning she threw was charging the air, ionizing the atmosphere, creating a storm that Zoro could use. But the pivotal moment was not the fight in the forest. It was what was happening in the Atlantic. The seepage from the vial had reached the ley lines of the earth. The will had connected with the voice. The sea king that the deep had seen surfaced off the coast of Long Island. It was a serpent, 3 miles long, covered in scales that reflected the starlight. It roared. The sound shattered windows in Queens. It caused a tidal wave that swamped the Rockaways. And it wasn't alone. Portals began to open. Not technological portals, but tears in the fabric of the Vought reality, caused by the rejection of the anime physics. The universe was trying to expel the foreign energy, but in doing so, it was tearing itself apart. From these tears, the logic of the One Piece world began to bleed in. In a hospital in Brooklyn, a patient with terminal cancer suddenly burst into flames, not dying, but becoming fire. A loggia manifestation. In a zoo in the Bronx, a jaguar escaped, but it stood on 2 legs and spoke with a human voice. A Zoan awakening. The devil fruit rules were infecting the timeline. The multiversal outcome had begun. Zoro, fighting in Vermont, felt the shift. He felt the sudden chaotic spike in the world's energy. He parried a blow from the Chimera that would have leveled a building, his feet sliding back through the dirt. He realized that he hadn't just broken a tower, he had broken the quarantine. Dan Edgar watched the satellite feed from his office. He saw the Sea King. He saw the reports of spontaneous mutations. He saw the fight in Vermont. He sat down, for the first time, looking truly old. He realized that Vought could not monetize this. This wasn't a product. This was an extinction event. He picked up the red phone on his desk. the direct line to the president. "Mr. President," Edgar said, his voice calm, "we have a scenario. I am authorizing the release of Soldier Boy, and I am recommending a nuclear strike on the coordinates in Vermont." Zoro sensed the intention before the order was even given. He felt the malice of the distant decision. He kicked the chimera away, slicing his chest open with a tatsumaki that sent the beast spinning into a cliff face. He looked up at Stormfront. "You people," Zoro said, his voice carrying over the thunder. "You play with toys. You don't know what a storm is." He sheathed his swords. He raised one hand to the sky. He wasn't calling down lightning. He was catching it. He was grabbing the electricity Stormfront had generated. "Mutoryu, Dragon Twister." He twisted his body, creating a vortex of air and captured lightning. He threw it at Stormfront. The attack caught her mid-flight. It wasn't just physical damage. It was a rejection of her element. She screamed as her own power turned against her, slamming her into the ground with the force of a meteorite. Zoro stood panting. He was done. He had nothing left. He fell to his knees. But the choice he had made, to save the boys, to destroy the serum, had a cost. The delay meant he was still there when the sky lit up, not with lightning, but with the re-entry trails of an ICBM. The government had listened to Edgar. They were nuking American soil to stop the infection. Zoro looked at the falling star. He laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. He couldn't cut a nuke. Not now. Not like this. But the nuke didn't hit. A shadow passed over the moon. A massive, winged shape. It wasn't a plane. It wasn't Homelander. It was a dragon. A blue dragon. Kaido had not come through. But the concept of the dragon had. The infection of reality had manifested the strongest creature as a defense mechanism of the chaotic energy. The dragon manifested from the storm clouds themselves, a construct of pure atmospheric will. It intercepted the missile. The explosion lit up the stratosphere, a second sun blooming in the night. The shockwave knocked Zoro unconscious. When he woke up, he wasn't in the forest. He was in a void, a white, empty space. And standing in front of him was not a human. It was a silhouette of a man with red hair and a straw hat. But it wasn't Shanks or Luffy. It was Joy Boy, or the memory of him. The figure didn't speak. It pointed. It pointed to the Vought universe. It showed Zoro the threads of destiny that were now tangled. It showed him that by breaking the vial, he had seeded the world with Haki. He had given the people the power to rebel, but also the power to destroy themselves. The small choice had democratized power in a world of fascists. Zoro woke up for real. He was in the back of the van again. Butcher was driving. The forest was burning behind them. "You're awake," Butcher said. He sounded terrified. "Look out the window." Zoro looked. They were driving along the Hudson. The river was gone. In its place was a jungle. A massive prehistoric jungle that had erupted from the water in minutes. The plants were carnivorous. The trees were mile-high mangroves. The geography of One Piece was overwriting the geography of New York. "What did you do?" Butcher asked. "I didn't do anything," Zoro said, closing his eye. "The world is just waking up." The complete destabilization of the setting. New York was now a green zone, a mix of primitive jungle and high-tech ruin. The Sea King circled Manhattan like a moat monster. The government had failed. Vought had failed. Homelander was nowhere to be seen. He had flown into the storm and vanished. The narrative had shifted from a crossover to a fusion. The rules were gone. The strong would survive. And in the ruins of the Vought Tower, a new flag was being raised by the survivors. It wasn't the American flag. It was a Jolly Roger, painted clumsily on a bedsheet, not out of piracy, but out of the desperate hope that the symbol of the man who fought the gods would protect them from the monsters. Butcher looked at Zoro in the rearview mirror. "So what's the plan now, Captain?" he asked, the sarcasm gone. Zoro touched his swords. He felt the hum of Enma. It was louder now. It liked this world. "We go to the tower," Zoro said. "The man in the cape is waiting, and I need to ask him where the hell the ocean went." The final confrontation was set, but it wouldn't be a fight for a city. It would be a fight for the right to define reality. The multiversal outcome was absolute. The Vought universe was dead. The age of pirates had begun in the ruins of corporate America. And somewhere in the newly formed jungle of Central Park, a fruit grew on a mutated oak tree. A purple, swirling fruit. A devil fruit, born from the radiation of the nuke and the Haki of the dragon. A squirrel ate it, and the squirrel began to laugh. The chaos was total. The stage was set for the final convergence. The world would burn, or it would be cut into a shape that made sense. Zoro tightened his bandana. He was ready to finish the job. He was ready to become the king of hell in a world that desperately needed a devil. The camera pulled back, revealing the globe. The continents were shifting. The red line was forming. The Grand Line was imposing itself on the Atlantic. The collision was complete. Now, only the survivors remained. The story of the boys was over. The story of the void century of Earth V had begun. Vaught's board of directors, huddled in a bunker in Nevada, watched the screens go black one by one. Stan Edgar remained calm. He poured a glass of whiskey. He toasted the end of the world. He knew that control was an illusion. He just hoped that whatever came next had a good profit margin. But deep down, he knew. Money was useless in the face of Haki. The currency had changed. The only gold that mattered now was the color of a conqueror's spirit. And the richest man in the world was bleeding in the back of a van, asking for a nap. The timeline was locked. The catastrophe was irreversible. The what if had become a what is. The end of the act saw the dawn of a new, terrible, and wondrous era. And it all started because a swordsman got lost on his way to the kitchen. The cosmic irony was the only thing that remained of the old world's humor. Everything else was survival. The image of the Sea King rearing its head above the Statue of Liberty, biting the torch off the statue and swallowing it whole. The light of liberty was extinguished, replaced by the fire of the wild. The screen faded to black, leaving only the sound of drums. The drums of liberation. They were beating in the Bronx. They were beating in the hearts of the oppressed. And they were beating a war rhythm that would shake the stars. The van roared through the emerald twilight of what used to be Fifth Avenue. The tires spun in mud that was thick, black, and smelled of prehistoric rot. Giant ferns, sprouting from the cracked pavement of luxury storefronts, brushed against the windshield, leaving smears of sap that hissed like acid. Billy Butcher wrestled with the steering wheel, his knuckles white, driving not with skill, but with the desperate aggression of a man trying to outrun the end of the world. In the back, Roronoa Zoro sat cross-legged, sharpening Wado Ichimonji with a whetstone he had found in the glove compartment. The rhythmic shh sound of the stone against the blade was the only thing grounding the crew in reality, for outside the windows, the logic of the Vought universe had completely collapsed. The city was no longer a grid of steel and glass. It was a vertical jungle, a necropolis of modernity consumed by the aggressive biology of the Grand Line. The seepage from the destroyed vial in Vermont had not just altered the geography, it had awakened the dormant potential in the environment. Skyscrapers were draped in vines that pulsed with a heartbeat. Cars were crushed under the roots of mangroves that grew 10 feet a minute, and from the shadows of the alleyways, things watched. Not rats, but creatures that had eaten the mutated fruits born of the radiation and Haki fallout. A pigeon the size of a hawk breathed fire from a rooftop. A stray dog with scales instead of fur barked a sound that cracked the nearby windows. The ecosystem had jumped 1 billion years of evolution in 6 hours, and at the center of this green hell stood Vought Tower, untouched by the vines, rising like a black tombstone against the bruised purple sky. Zoro sheathed the blade. He checked the bandages on his torso. The pain was a distant, dull throb, suppressed by the adrenaline and the overwhelming pressure of the atmosphere. The air here was heavy. It wasn't just humidity. It was the spiritual weight of a city holding its breath. The Haki density in Manhattan had spiked to levels that rivaled Onigashima. Every living thing was radiating a will to survive, creating a cacophony of voices in Zoro's head that he had to actively block out. He looked at the boys. Huey was catatonic, staring at a tree that was eating a mailbox. Frenchie was mixing chemicals in a frenzy, muttering about neutralizing agents. MM was cleaning his guns, though he knew bullets were becoming increasingly irrelevant. Butcher slammed on the brakes. The van skidded to a halt 50 yards from the main entrance of Vought Tower. The plaza, once a pristine expanse of concrete and corporate art, was a battlefield, but it wasn't the police fighting. It was Vought security fighting the environment. Men in high-tech armor were firing flamethrowers at vines that thrashed like tentacles. A massive carnivorous plant, resembling a Venus flytrap but the size of a bus, had clamped its jaws around a tactical vehicle, crushing it like a soda can. The screams of the dying mercenaries were cut short by the snapping of jaws. Zoro kicked the back doors open. He stepped out into the humid air. The smell was intense. Ozone, blood, chlorophyll, and the metallic tang of fear. He didn't draw his swords yet. He walked toward the chaos. The plant monster sensed him. It dropped the crushed tank and whipped its vines toward the swordsman. The vines moved faster than whips, breaking the sound barrier. Zoro didn't break stride. He projected a short burst of intimidation, a focused glare of Haoshoku. The vines froze in mid-air. The plant trembled, then slowly retracted its tendrils, cowering back into the crater it had dug. The Vought soldiers, seeing this, stopped firing. They looked at the man in the green coat. They dropped their weapons. They ran. Zoro didn't chase them. He looked up at the tower. The top 40 floors were shrouded in storm clouds that swirled in a tight, unnatural vortex. Red lightning arced between the spires. Homelander was up there, and he wasn't alone. Zoro could feel another presence, something cold, mechanical, and void of all humanity. It felt like a sword without a hilt, a weapon that cut the hand that held it. Butcher walked up beside him, holding his crowbar. He looked at the tower, then at Zoro. He asked if this was it. He asked if they were going to kill the bastard, or if they were just going to die in a fancy lobby. Zoro adjusted his bandana. He told Butcher that dying was not part of the plan. He said he had a promise to keep to a rubber man, and he wasn't going to break it in a place that didn't even have good sake. They entered the lobby. It was a slaughterhouse. The marble floors were slick with blood. The golden statues of the seven were smashed. In the center of the room, guarding the elevators, stood Black Noir. But it wasn't the Noir they knew. He had been unmasked, revealing a face that was a ruin of burn scars and metal plates. His body had been pumped full of the experimental compound Vive variants that Vought had been hoarding. His muscles were swollen to the point of bursting, tearing his suit, and in his hands He held two blades that glowed with a sickly, artificial purple light. Vought had tried to replicate Haki technology. They had forged blades infused with the synthesized energy from the Vermont samples. Noir didn't speak. He screamed. It was a digital, distorted screech that shattered the glass of the reception desk. He launched himself at Zoro. The speed was blinding. Noir moved like a glitch in the video feed. He was faster than A-Train, stronger than the Deep. The purple blade slashed at Zoro's throat. Zoro drew Sandai Kitetsu and blocked. The impact created a shockwave that blew the doors off the elevators. Zoro slid back, his boots carving grooves into the marble. He frowned. The energy in Noir's blades was chaotic, corrosive. It was eating at the steel of Kitetsu. This wasn't Haki. It was radioactive decay weaponized as force. Zoro realized he couldn't prolong this. If he played with this thing, his swords would break. He needed to end it in one strike. He shifted his grip. He closed his eye, focusing not on the enemy's body, but on the core of the artificial energy driving him. He breathed in, the breath of the building, the breath of the twisted metal. Itoryu ai, shishi son son. Zoro disappeared. He reappeared behind Noir, sheathing his sword with a click. Noir stood still for a second. Then, a thin line appeared vertically down the center of his body. The artificial energy destabilized. Noir didn't fall apart. He dissolved. The chaotic energy consumed his flesh, turning him into a pile of grey ash that scattered across the floor. The purple blades clattered to the ground, their glow fading. Butcher whistled low. He stepped over the ash. He hit the elevator button. The light lit up. Even in the apocalypse, the service elevators worked. The ride up was silent. The numbers on the display ticked upward. 50, 60, 70. The air pressure in the car dropped. Zoro's ears popped. He felt the Haki above them growing stronger. It wasn't the refined, kingly aura of Shanks or Luffy. It was a jagged, broken thing. It felt like a child throwing a tantrum with the power of a nuclear warhead. It was the Haki of absolute entitlement. Homelander had unlocked his potential, but he had done it through the lens of his own psychosis. He believed he was the center of the universe, and now the universe was being forced to agree. The doors opened on the 99th floor. The wind howled. The windows were gone, blown out by the pressure. The conference table was split in half. Standing on the balcony, hovering 3 feet off the ground, was the Homelander. He looked different. His suit was torn. His cape was gone. His hair was white, not from age, but from the stress of his body processing the timeline shift. His eyes were no longer glowing red. They were black, pitch-black voids that absorbed the light, and around him the air rippled with black lightning. He had achieved it, the color of the Supreme King, but it was inverted. It wasn't the power to lead, it was the power to subjugate. Homelander turned to face them. He didn't smile, he didn't monologue. He simply looked at Zoro, and for the first time, Zoro felt a chill. This man was no longer a bully. He was a calamity. "You broke my house," Homelander whispered. His voice was amplified by the Haki, echoing from every corner of the room simultaneously. "You broke my city. You broke my toy box." Zoro walked out onto the balcony. The wind whipped his green coat. He drew all 3 swords. He tied the black bandana tight. He bit down on Wado. "I didn't break it," Zoro said, his voice muffled by the hilt. "I just woke it up." Homelander screamed. It was a sound that ruptured the eardrums of the boys, forcing them to cover their ears and drop to their knees. A wave of black Haki exploded from Homelander's body, a physical wall of force that pulverized the furniture and stripped the paint from the walls. Zoro didn't step back. He flared his own Haki. The green aura of the King of Hell rose to meet the black tide. The two pressures collided in the center of the room. The floor buckled. The building groaned, the steel girders twisting like wet rags. Then they clashed. It wasn't a fight. It was a natural disaster contained within 1,000 square feet. Homelander flew at Zoro, his fists coated in the black energy. Zoro met him with a 3-sword crossblock. The impact blew the roof off the tower. Debris rained down on the jungle below. Homelander was strong. Physically, he was stronger than Kaido. His muscles were dense, built in a lab to be indestructible. But he lacked technique. He swung wild, relying on the crushing weight of his power. Zoro deflected, parried, and dodged. He was dancing on the edge of a razor. One hit from those black fists would liquefy his organs. He used the foxfire style to cut the heat vision blasts that Homelander mixed into his punches. He used paper art to dodge the supersonic rushes, but he was losing ground. The sheer stamina of the Supe was endless. Homelander didn't get tired. He only got angrier. Homelander grabbed Enma with his bare hand. The blade cut into his palm, drawing blood, but he didn't let go. He squeezed. The blade groaned. Homelander pulled Zoro in, headbutting him. Zoro's vision swam. His nose shattered. He flew backward, crashing through the wall into the elevator shaft. He caught himself on a cable hanging over the abyss. Homelander floated into the shaft, his eyes black voids. "Is that it?" Homelander asked. "Is that the power of the outside world? It's pathetic. I am the only thing that matters. I'm the only thing that is real." Zoro hung there, blood dripping from his face into the darkness. He looked at Enma. The sword was pulsing. It was angry. It felt the disrespect. It felt the hand of the Force God on its hilt. It demanded more Haki. It demanded everything. Zoro grinned. It was a terrifying, bloody expression. "You think you're real?" he rasped. "You're just a product in a cape. You don't know what it means to carry a weight." Zoro let go of the cable. He fell. Homelander watched him fall, confused. Was he giving up? No. As he fell, Zoro poured every ounce of his remaining life force into his swords. His arms turned black. The swords turned black. The green aura condensed, becoming solid, heavy, and sharp enough to cut the concept of distance. He spun in the air, kicking off the wall of the shaft, launching himself upward like a green meteor. Santoryu Ogi, Rengoku Onigiri. He didn't aim for the body. He aimed for the spirit. He aimed for the source of the Haki. Homelander saw him coming. He gathered all his black energy into a single beam of heat vision, a final blast meant to vaporize the swordsman. The beam met the swords. There was no sound. The energy was too dense for sound waves to propagate. There was only a flash of light that turned the night into noon. The top 20 floors of Vought Tower disintegrated. Not exploded. Disintegrated. The matter was simply erased by the friction of the two conflicting realities. When the light faded, the tower was a stump. The top was gone, sheared off at a perfect diagonal angle. Zoro landed on the slanted edge of the ruin. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. He had no swords in his hands. They were scattered on the ground. He fell onto his back, staring up at the stars. Homelander was floating 10 feet away. He looked untouched. His suit was pristine. His hair was perfect. He looked down at Zoro and smiled. "I told you," Homelander said. "I can do whatever I want." Then a line of blood appeared on his chest, then another on his neck, then another on his forehead. Homelander touched his face. His hand came away red. He looked at it, confused. He tried to speak, but his voice failed. The realization hit him. He hadn't just been cut, his will had been cut. The belief that held his biology together, the narcissism that fueled his invulnerability, had been severed. Homelander began to cry. It was a small, human sound. He looked at the city below, the jungle he couldn't control. He looked at the stars he could no longer reach. He fell. He didn't fly. He fell like a man. He hit the slanted roof and rolled, tumbling off the edge, down into the darkness of the jungle below. There was no impact tremor, just the silence of the abyss, swallowing a stone. Zoro closed his eye. He was done. Butcher crawled out from behind a piece of rubble. He was covered in dust, bleeding from the ears. He looked at the edge where Homelander had fallen. He looked at Zoro. He walked over and sat down next to him. "Is he dead?" Butcher asked. "He's done," Zoro muttered. "Being a god is hard work. He quit." Butcher laughed. It was a dry, hacking cough. He looked out at the city. The jungle was still there. The Sea King was still swimming in the harbor. The monsters were still prowling. The death of the Homelander hadn't fixed anything. The world was still broken. The timeline was still fused. "So," Butcher said, lighting a cigarette with a shaking hand, "we won. And we're still in deep shit." "Yeah," Zoro said. "That's how it usually goes." Zoro sat up, groaning. He gathered his swords. Wado was fine. Katetsu was chipped. Enma was glowing, satisfied. He looked at the horizon. The sun was rising. It was a strange sun, larger and redder than it should be. The geography of the world had changed permanently. The continents had shifted. The concept of countries was failing. The era of the superheroes was over. The era of the warlords was beginning. Stan Edgar's helicopter lifted off from a pad in the distance, fleeing the city. Zoro watched it go. He didn't care. He wasn't a Marine. He wasn't a revolutionary. He was just a swordsman who wanted to get back to his crew. He turned to Butcher. "Do you have a boat?" Butcher blew smoke into the morning air. He looked at the flooded streets, at the river that was now an ocean. He grinned. "I reckon we can find one," Butcher said. "But you're navigating, Captain." Zoro scowled. "Shut up." They walked to the edge of the ruin. The boys gathered behind them. Frenchie, Huey. They were battered, traumatized and changed. They had seen the impossible. They had fought alongside a myth. They looked at the new world with fear, but also with a strange sense of freedom. The corporate boot was off their neck. Now they just had to survive the jungle. As they descended the ruin of the tower, the camera panned out. It showed the skyline of New York, overgrown and wild. It showed the Statue of Liberty, headless, holding a sword instead of a torch, a trick of the light, or perhaps a sign of things to come. And far, far away, across the dimensional rift that was slowly sealing but leaving its scars, a straw hat fluttered in the wind on the deck of the Thousand Sunny. Luffy paused in the middle of eating a giant piece of meat. He looked at the sky. He smiled. "Zoro's having fun," Luffy said. Back in New York, the roar of a T-Rex echoed through Wall Street. The conflict was over. The crossover was complete. The story of the boys had ended, and the legend of the lost swordsman had been etched into the history of a universe that would never be the same. There was no reset button. There was no going back. There was only the path forward, and it was covered in thorns. Zoro stepped into the jungle. He didn't know where he was going, but for the first time in this wretched timeline, he felt at home. The chaos was honest. The danger was real. And the booze, he hoped, was somewhere in the next tavern. He walked into the green, and the shadows of the ferns swallowed him whole, leaving only the legend behind. The timeline held its breath, scarred, mutated, but alive. and in the silence of the new dawn, the faint, rhythmic sound of drums could be heard, beating the pulse of a liberated, terrifying world. The recording from the black box of the Vought International server room was recovered 6 months after the event, now classified by historians as the Green Divergence. The audio was corrupted, filled with the static of a reality that had been stretched too thin. But the final log entry from Stan Edgar remained legible. It was not a resignation. It was a liquidation order for assets that no longer existed. The world that woke up after the fall of the tower was not the world that had gone to sleep. The stock market had not just crashed, it had been rendered obsolete. In the new economy, the value of a corporation was zero compared to the value of a ship that could survive the carnivorous tides of the new Atlantic. The United States had fractured into city-states, isolated by the sudden, violent growth of the Grand Line geography that had overwritten the interstate highway system. Manhattan had become a forbidden zone, a temple of greenery and silence where the laws of physics were still considered suggestions rather than rules. The diagonal cut on the stump of Vought Tower had become a pilgrimage site. Survivors, warlords, and those seeking strength traveled through the jungle of Fifth Avenue to touch the smooth, glass-like surface where the stone had been severed. They did not leave flowers. They left weapons. It was a shrine to the concept of the limits break, a physical proof that godhood could be dismantled with enough will. The cult of the sword had replaced the cult of the seven. Dojos sprang up in the ruins of the Bronx, where young men and women trained with rusted pipes and wooden sticks, trying to replicate the black hardening of the skin they had seen on the pirate's face. Most failed. Some died. But a few, the ones with the right kind of desperation, began to manifest a faint, invisible armor. The monopoly on power had been broken, democratized by the contagion of Haki. Billy Butcher was never seen in New York again. Rumors placed him on a retrofitted Coast Guard cutter, sailing south toward the equator, hunting the sea kings that now patrolled the shipping lanes. He was no longer a terrorist or a Fed. He was a captain. The boys had disbanded, scattering into the new world to find their own ways to survive. Huey Campbell had opened a safe zone in the Catskills, using Frenchie's knowledge to create barriers against the mutant fauna. They were no longer fighting a corporation. They were fighting the world itself, and for the first time, the fight felt fair. The hierarchy of genetic destiny was gone. If you wanted to survive now, you didn't need a drug. You needed guts. As for the Homelander, the official story was that he died in the collapse. Vought remnants tried to spin a narrative of a heroic sacrifice, but the signal didn't carry. The truth was far more pathetic and far more dangerous. Travelers passing through the dense, fog-choked forests of Central Park reported hearing a sound at night. It wasn't the roar of a monster. It was the weeping of a child. They spoke of a pale, white-haired figure that scurried on all fours, hiding from the light, terrified of his own reflection. The god had become a goblin, haunting the ruins of his own ego, stripped of the fear that had fed him. He was no longer the protagonist of reality. He was a cautionary tale whispered around campfires, a story about what happens when a man who believes he is everything meets a man who wants nothing but a challenge. The timeline did not heal. The scar remained, a permanent fusion of two cosmologies. The trans-dimensional rift that had brought Roronoa Zoro to this earth had eventually sealed, stitching the wound shut. But the infection remained. The one-piece physics had taken root. In the final satellite image taken before the orbital grid failed, the shape of the clouds over the Atlantic had changed. They no longer moved with the wind. They moved with a purpose, and far out at sea, where the water turned black and the depth became infinite, a single moss-green bandana floated on the waves, drifting toward a horizon that promised adventure. The swordsman was gone, likely lost in another direction entirely, but he had left the door open. The age of heroes was dead. The great pirate era of the Vought universe had just begun.